I cannot give this talk the kind of close scrutiny that I would like to do. There's lots of neat little details in here that I think we're going to you'll have to find out for yourself. But we see in these two chapters a number of the different themes that I spoke about in our introductory talk, the things that are unique to Luke, that we see that kind of characterize his writing. These are very, very interesting scenes to almost visualize, especially in chapter 7, where we see him encountering these people. You can almost picture, if you have in your mind what Jesus may have looked like at the age of 30, living on this earth, you can almost picture him touching that casket. You can almost picture him as he speaks about the woman who comes and kind of crashes the party. You can almost visualize that, because Luke really is gifted in the way he uses words to write. He also speaks often, several times in this passage, about Jesus as being the Son of Man. This is a wonderful way for Luke, who is speaking about the humanity of Jesus. That's one of the themes that he has through his gospel, and especially as he is directing his gospel toward non-Jewish people. And so having Jesus as the Son of Man is one of the characteristics that Luke uses particularly. There's this focus on women. We have women particularly displayed in this section. His sensitivity to the poor and the downtrodden, to looking at little details of their lives. This man's right hand is the one that was paralyzed, and so none of the other gospel writers tell us it was his right hand, and yet you can almost picture this man having to stand up and raise his right hand, which he would not have been able to do if the Lord had not empowered him and given him that ability to do. So his concentration on the poor and the downtrodden is a really attractive thing to us, isn't it, in this day and age? The priority of prayer that Jesus had made in his life, particularly as we look at him praying all night before he identifies the apostles that are going to be carrying the message. So throughout these two chapters, we can kind of pick up some Luke-isms in that regard and grow in our knowledge of how he's presenting Jesus. I've tried to organize this so that you can just figure out where I might be going. And so I have, if you can read on the board, I think the first thing we need to look at is in verses 1 through 11 of chapter 6, and that is this controversy about the Sabbath confrontation. Because that becomes a main issue, not only for Luke, and that's why I wasn't mentioning it with regard to how Luke specifically looks at things. Each one of the gospel writers have incidents about this growing tendency for the Pharisees to be against Jesus, and one of the most provocative areas is how Jesus handles the Sabbath. So that's our first thing we'll look at. Secondly, we're going to look at some kingdom business kind of thing. He's going to choose the apostles, and he's going to describe what the kingdom looks like and what it's like to be a part of the kingdom. That's in the rest of chapter 6, verses 12 through 49. Kingdom business is what we're looking at. And then I have taken all of chapter 7 because I think it's just of some snapshots of how Jesus interacted in compassion with these people who would be coming into his life. He was his antennae were always out in looking at that. And so he's always exercising the attribute of God himself, which is that he is compassionate. So compassion demonstration, that's not a very good way to put it, but if you want to write that down, at least it'll help you identify where we're going. Compassion demonstration, and that's the entire chapter 7. So we have a long way to go, and I'm glad we've revved up here in our doing. Now for Luke, moving from chapter 5 into chapter 6, there would have been no break like we have. The chapters were done, as many of you know, years and years and years later to kind of help those of us who needed help in finding specific places and maybe identifying thought patterns and all. But Luke would be writing, and he would be writing at the end of chapter 5, and he would have been talking about this question about fasting and how these Pharisees were in Jesus' face about the fact that his disciples were happy instead of fasting. And so Jesus identifies the fact that there is now going to be a new order with regard to that. And only those stick-in-the-muds are going to be wanting to stick to the very old ways, because the new way is so much better. The new wine, so to speak, is so much better. So in the same breath then, in chapter 6, verse 1, he says, oh yes, and one Sabbath, here's now going to be an illustration of what the contrast between the old and the new. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples began to pick up some heads of grain, rub them in their hands, and eat the kernels. Some of the Pharisees asked, why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? So they're confronting Jesus. Why were they watching him going from one place to another? They were probably staking out some people who were trying to catch him in doing something that they could accuse him of with regard to that. They'll always look, even at the end of this, they're even more intense about looking for ways to condemn him. Just thinking about the Sabbath now, I want to do a little background with regard to that, because for many of us, the Sabbath is a kind of a muddy thought with regard to that. First of all, we understand that in the Jewish world, the Sabbath was celebrated on the seventh day of the week. That's what the Sabbath is about. It was very significant to the Jewish nation, and of course the attitude of these Pharisees reflects the fact that there was something really significant in observing the Sabbath. They observed the Sabbath because God had commanded it. The initiation of the thought of the Sabbath, of course, comes from the creation account in Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 and 3, where at the end of the 6 days, on the seventh day, it is said that God rested from his labors. Did God need to rest? No. But he finished his work, and so the understanding of the completion of the work and the understanding of being a model for now those who would be following him to take a rest in one day of 7. In Exodus chapter 20, in the giving of the law, in verses 8 to 11, you will find that it is said that they were to remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And the reason given is because God himself rested from creation. So the Jewish nation understood at Mount Sinai the initiation of the law, giving of the law. How does God want us to run this kingdom that he's giving us? Because God rested, then his creatures are also to rest one day out of 7. And this was designated as, we would call it Saturday, the 7th day of the week. When the law is reiterated in Deuteronomy chapter 5, there's another aspect that is mentioned about the keeping of the Sabbath, and that is, if you want to just jot down the passage, you can look later. Deuteronomy 5, 12 to 15. Much of the wording is the same in this second saying of the law, but what is mentioned now as the reason for the Jews to keep the Sabbath is because God had delivered them from Egypt. And so the remembrance and the celebration of God's delivering them from slavery is an important understanding that the Jews had. This was a big deal for the Jews, and so it was. When the Jews were out of God's will, when they did all this bad stuff in the Old Testament and had to be judged and exiled into Babylon, one of the things that God had against them was that they didn't keep the Sabbath. Very, very important in God's eyes that this be kept. Now, you and I, as a part of the new covenant, we observe the Lord's Day, one day in 7, but we understand that we celebrate and are joyful about the resurrection of Christ, and understand that this is the direction that the majority of the church, the huge majority of the church, has since the days after the resurrection, enjoyed celebrating the fact that our Lord rose from the dead on the first day of the week. And so while many of us understand that the principle of one day in 7 has not been dissolved, we have switched the day now from the 7th day, even though we certainly celebrate deliverance, God's work in creation and all of that. We have switched it now until the first day of the week. There are some believers, as you know, who would choose to celebrate the 7th day because they don't see in the New Testament any particular command to observe the first day of the week. But we understand from Christian history that that was something that the first believers in Christ actually did. We understand that this pleases God, as well as being a benefit for each person, because that's the way God wired us, to have this one day in 7. One of my very favorite passages of the Old Testament is Isaiah 58, which we cannot take time to turn to, but it talks about how God enjoys it when we enjoy this one day in 7 in resting from our labors and in having time in that day to think about Him. What pleases you, Lord? What can I do? And of course, it would be fun for us to take some time and really discuss this, and we can't do that. This is just seed for thought. And if you're going out to lunch with somebody from this group, why don't you talk about it and see what you can do? The Pharisees, though, in their desire, way back in the intertestamental period when they were formed, in their desire to make sure they didn't break the law, they wanted to be the holiest of people, they had decided that we'll put some fences around the Sabbath. And so they had developed, I don't know, hundreds of little deals that you couldn't do on the Sabbath, because if you did them, you'd be pushing your toes over the line and offending God by breaking the Sabbath. And that's what this is about here. And that is that although, as Jesus and His disciples were walking through these grain fields, they were hungry, and so they picked some grain and they rubbed it in their hands, and then they ate the kernel that was there. The Pharisees, the ones who were staked out watching for Jesus, they accused them then of working, because they had harvested, they had processed the food, and they had actually prepared the food. You know, the Orthodox Jews today don't prepare any food on Saturday; they prepare it on Friday, and so that's what these Pharisees were accusing Jesus of. And now, by their definition, Jesus and his group had violated the commandment. What did Jesus tell them? He says, first of all, that there can be a way of living your life so that on the seventh day, if indeed you do what David did, and he quotes from, or he cites David's example when he was fleeing from Saul, and there was no opportunity for them to have anything to eat, but they were given this consecrated bread. This was, of course, a work of necessity, because they needed that food. And Jesus says a work of necessity is all right to be done on the Sabbath. You don't have to worry about fencing yourself in with regard to that. So the first principle that Jesus says, as far as what's okay on the Sabbath, on the Lord's Day, is a work of necessity. In verses 6 to 11, he goes into in the synagogue, and here's another place where they're trying to trap him. They probably have set this guy there, this man with a paralyzed hand. And so as they're watching to see what he will do, because they know he's a compassionate man, they know that there will be some confrontation with regard to that. Jesus now, as he looks here in verse 9, he says, I ask you, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or destroy it? And he then, without even actually touching the man, without actually doing any work, he speaks, and the man's hand is healed. He does a work of mercy on the Sabbath. And so the second thing that Jesus says is okay to do on the Sabbath is a work of mercy, works of necessity and works of mercy. Now, Matthew's account in Matthew 12 gives a further reason, because Matthew includes the example of the priests on the Sabbath in the temple doing their work. And he says these priests do their work on the Sabbath, and they are not considered guilty, because this is the third principle of what is okay to do on the Sabbath, and that is works of piety. Works of piety. Those were the men who were serving in the temple. So three things that Jesus identifies as ways that a person who doesn't want to offend God, who doesn't want to break the law, but who still sees needs, has necessity. Those things has a job to do on the Sabbath, that those can be done. Jesus implies that if you see something, a need that needs to be met on the Sabbath under those categories, and you don't meet it, it's sin. What is it? James tells us, to him who knows to do good and doesn't do it, that is sin. And so that's another implication that these Pharisees were saying so far back and so insensitive to what was happening that they were actually offending God in a worse way, because they were refusing to be in the flow of the acts of mercy and piety that were being done. And so breaking the Sabbath was a capital offense in the Jewish mind. So what did they do at the end? In verse 11, these watchers, these people who were trapping him, they were furious and began to discuss with one another what they might do to Jesus. And so Luke is inserting here now the understanding that even in these very early days, this is still about the first, or well, a little bit into the second year of his ministry, there is already this animosity, this need to somehow get rid of Jesus, because he is certainly rattling all the things that were essential to these people in their religious work. Now, Jesus was not destroying the Sabbath. What does he say in the account of Matthew? I didn't come to destroy the law, but I came to fulfill it. Instead, he is showing where their practice, the legalists' practice, was differing from what God really had in mind when he had instituted this wonderful day, this day of celebration, this day of physical rest, as well as day to be able to concentrate on God himself. So in the first instance here, we have Jesus now with this Sabbath confrontation. Luke includes this, as well as the other gospel writers. Now Luke moves us into another one of these time things, one of these days, so he's not really giving us a chronological sense with regard to this, but he's saying this also happened at this particular time, in this particular time frame. What does he do? He has some kingdom business to work on. And what do we have? Starting in verse 12 of chapter 6, we have an account that the other gospel writers give as well, and that is that he went on, the other writers don't say that he prayed all night, but they do indicate that Jesus, understanding the hugeness of the choice of these 12 men, takes a whole night to confer with the Father. Can you imagine the intimacy that was taking place during that night? All night he is praying to God. And then when morning came, he called the disciples to him. We have a distinction now between disciples, which is a learner, and there were bunches of them who were following Jesus. Some of them kind of flaked off toward as the time went on and as his teaching got a little bit harder. But there were a number of very faithful people who followed. They wanted to learn, and so they followed practically every step that Jesus made. But now he's going to designate 12 of those people as apostles, because these are going to now have a special function in the kingdom. This is why this is kingdom business. Mark is a little more specific when he speaks about what Jesus was doing when he chose these people. In Mark 3, verses 14 and 15, it says, he chose them that they might be with him, of course, to be a learner, but also to kind of have on-the-job training, and that he might send them out. That's what apostle is, a messenger. He might send them out to preach and to have authority to drive out demons. And during this time of learning, during the ministry of Jesus on earth, there were a couple of times where he actually deployed these people, others as well. One time there were 70 of them, other time there were 12, and they went out and they actually did what Jesus was training them to do, and that was to preach, to heal the sick, and to drive out demons. So we have now a large group of disciples growing every day, and now we also have this little group that is now being identified as the ones who are to carry the message. And of course, if you're studying the book of Acts with us in First Baptist Church Sunday School, you will know that this is what they're doing now. They're actually fulfilling the call that Jesus gave them at this particular time. The lists are somewhat different in a way. Usually the Jewish people would have more than one given name depending on how it was being used. And so if you're trying to identify from Matthew and from Mark and from Luke the various ones, you might find that there were a couple of variations. Like Thaddeus, I think, is, forgot what his name is. I didn't write that down. Anyway, there are several that, and of course, Peter's name is always first in any list. And who's the last? Judas Iscariot is always last. And usually the gospel writer says, and Judas Iscariot who betrayed him. And so here now are the 12. These are the ones who have been chosen to be really intimate followers of Jesus. So that's the first bit of business, as he's working on the kingdom, he's identifying these people who are going to be messengers. Then he goes and speaks about what life is like in the kingdom. And starting in verse 17, he gives what is a summarized account of the larger teaching that Matthew describes in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. We call that, the teaching in Matthew, we call it the Sermon on the Mount. If you look at verse 17, it says, he went down with them and stood on a level place. And so the scholars are not sure if we're speaking now about the same big talk that is described in Matthew 5, or if indeed this was one of Jesus' teaching points. I know from when I was giving a lot of talks when I was in leadership in Bible Study Fellowship that often I would be speaking about the same themes in a different occasion because they were relevant with regard to that. And Jesus' teaching there was continuity to it. And so this may be that it's a different time if this is indeed what some of the commentators call the Sermon on the Plain. To me, it sounds like it could be the same thing, and Luke is just recording it in a smaller form. He doesn't include all of the things, but he does include, what he does have is what Matthew includes as well. And these are really principles of the kingdom. What is it going to be like to live in the kingdom? Well, first of all, verses 20 to 26, we have what's it like to be in relationship to God. And so he has the 4 Beatitudes, not nearly as many as Matthew has. He speaks about, blessed are you poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who hunger now, for you will be satisfied. And then he goes on, there are 4 of those Beatitudes. There are also 4 woes that correspond to what life is like outside of the kingdom. What's life like lived for the moment? With having the riches that you need, with regard to being well fed. What is it that is going to be like for those people? We often think of these woes as being kind of declamatory. You know, he's pointing his finger and he's really angry. But the word in the original language has much more to do with a grief statement, a sad statement. I am so sorry that you are living your life under these standards instead of under the godly standards that are given. And so relationship to God is given in that. And there's a very famous quote says that Jesus in his teaching promises that Christians will be completely fearless, absurdly happy, and constantly in trouble. You may have heard that. I'll read it again in case you want to write it down. They'll be completely fearless, because he talks about the fact that they will be able to stand up to the kings. Completely fearless, absurdly happy, blessed are you, blessed are you, blessed are you, and then in constant trouble. I'm not sure exactly who said that, but it's one that really grabs us, doesn't it, with regard to that. This is how Jesus describes life in the kingdom. Now, relationship to others is also a very integral part of life in the kingdom. And so starting in verse 27, going through 42, we have some principles of the kingdom about how you relate to other people. First of all, he speaks starting in verse 27 and going down through that section through 36. He speaks about, first of all, the golden rule, which was not an uncommon thing. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But what does he add? Do good to your enemies. Does he not? And so one of the principles of the kingdom, again, countercultural, against what my my natural bent is against what society tells me. Do good to those who hate you. Pray for those who are despitefully using you. And so he says the surprise in the kingdom is, yes, you can treat others as you will have them treat you, but those who don't treat you well, you still love them and pray for them. Why are you doing this? Well, in verse 36, it says, what you'll be doing as you just demonstrate this is you're going to be demonstrating the character of God. Be merciful just as your Father in heaven is merciful. Members of the kingdom do this not to gain entrance into the kingdom, but they do it because they're in the kingdom. The life of Christ, the life of God, which is more fully developed as we go further in the Gospels and in the epistles, that life is going to now spring forth into the kind of thinking and the kind of action that is characteristic now only of God, only of the kingdom, because it certainly isn't a human characteristic. Be merciful, he says, even as your Father in heaven is merciful. Don't judge, he says, verse 37. We are condemned today if people think we are judging people. A Bible teacher I heard recently said, it used to be that John 3:16 was the most common verse in the secular world. Everybody knew what John 3:16 is. Now, the verse that everybody in the secular world knows is don't judge because you will be judged, because we're in a society where what you think is right for you and what I think is right for me. And so Jesus says don't judge. Now that means don't condemn a person. Don't use your standard of judgment to condemn a person, because that's allowed only for God. But we are called in other places to be discerning, because there is a definite responsibility on the part of members of the kingdom to discern between right and wrong. We leave it up to God to be the judge. And in fact, we'll see a little bit more about that. Jesus says, then as he's going on, he says, you need to take care of yourself first before you even are looking at anybody else to see how they are measuring up to God. And so he talks about, in 39, he talks about a parable about blind men leading the blind, and they're going to both fall into the ditch. And then a bit of divine humor, he says, you need to take care of this log that's in your own eye before you try to take out a little speck with regard to the other person. So take care of yourself. Be sure you're right with God, Jesus says, one of the principles of the kingdom, before you try to help or to judge others. Then lastly, at this particular point, we have in verses 43 to 49, what's it going to look like to other people when you are living in the kingdom? Well, first of all, you're going to be bearing good fruit. He talks about the tree bearing good fruit. He says, what will come out of you is what's been put in. And so there will be fruit. And some person years ago spoke about the fact that we're not supposed to be judges, but we can be fruit inspectors. And so Jesus is talking about bearing fruit with regard to that. No good tree bears bad fruit, etc. But then he says the other thing that's going to be characteristic of living in the kingdom is that because you are built on a firm foundation, you are grounded in that firm foundation, you'll be able to withstand anything that life throws at you. And so living in the kingdom is characterized by these particular things with regard to bearing fruit and with regard to standing sturdy, even though life throws terrible things at you. So Jesus describes kingdom life. Then quickly in chapter 7, these wonderful little postcards, snapshots of how Jesus interacted with people. First of all, we have in verses 1 to 10 how he interacted with this Gentile, this centurion, on long distance actually. Here's a man who is a Roman officer. He would have been hated by the people whose country he was occupying, but this man evidently had a heart for God. And so he had really made himself dear to the Jewish community, to the point that it's not the centurion who comes and asks Jesus to heal his servant, but it's the Jews who say, this guy has been so good to us. Would you please intervene in the life of this servant, this slave that he is so worried about? And so Jesus is intending to go and do this healing. But then the centurion says, sends a message and says, I know this thing about authority. I know that I'm responsible for a number of people, but I'm also responsible to a higher authority. Unsaid, but I see authority in you. And so I know that even the kind of authority you have is able to heal my servant, even though you're not in the actual physical presence. He had a huge concept of what it's like to have the authority of God living in the present day. And so Jesus, without a word, with a thought, with his creative energy, is able to heal that person, demonstrating that. So first of all, Jesus has compassion toward this, and by the way, he's a Gentile. What does it say in verse 9 of chapter 7? When Jesus heard this, that the man said, don't bother to come, just say the word. He said, when Jesus heard this, he was amazed at him. And turning to the crowd following him, said, I tell you, I have not found such great faith even in Israel. He marveled at this Gentile man, this outsider, this unlikely person who was so clued into the kingdom that he knew how the kingdom would work and how Jesus would work. Jesus then encounters one day in this town of Nain, he encounters a funeral procession. A widow, we're told, this widow, her son had died. It was an only son. Luke gives us some very, very compassionate and specific details about this woman and about the crisis that she would have had as a widow. He doesn't say it specifically, but we know that in that culture, a widow without any kind of support would really have a very hard time even surviving life, because everything would have been against her. And so Jesus has, what does it say here, verse 13, when the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her, and he said, don't cry. So he reaches out and touches this. It wasn't actually a coffin like we would think about, even though the NIV uses that, but it was probably the kind of stretcher that they had shrouded the body in that would then go into the rock tomb that it would be. He reaches out and touches this, so he stops the funeral procession, and he raises this young man to life. He says, young man, I say to you, get up. And the dead man got up. And so here we see that people are filled with awe, and they praised God and spoke about the fact that here must be a great prophet. One of his signature statements, this news about Jesus spread throughout Judea and the surrounding country. Now, this next episode is a little bit incongruous in that it's about John the Baptist, whom we know from other sources was thrown into prison by Herod. And he sends his disciples, now the people who are still loyal to John, and he sends them to Jesus, and he says, are you the one that I said you were? Are you the one that was promised? Was I really the messenger? Were the promised messenger? Are you really the Messiah? Here's this man in prison. He's not seeing the kingdom happen. He has really both feet in the old covenant. And so at this point, he is wondering, is this actually true? What does Jesus do? He gives him the same message that we saw in chapter 4 that he read in the synagogue when he was teaching. Go back, verse 22, report to John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cured, the deaf are here, the dead are raised, and the good news is preached to the poor. And then he says, hang in there, John. Blessed is the man who does not fall away on account of me. It's happening. It's happening. It's just not happening in your timing. We don't know. There is no report about whether this really encouraged John. I can imagine it would have. We don't know that. And of course, we do know that he was beheaded rather soon after that. But Jesus now, after these emissaries go back, he takes time to speak about the value of John the Baptist. He says, when you went out to see him, you saw a man's man. You saw somebody with authority. You saw somebody who didn't mince words. You saw somebody who was really fulfilling all of the role of a prophet, he said. And so he said, you didn't see him in the fancy salons of places, but he says, you saw actually more than a prophet because, and then this is where Jesus employs in verse 27, the prophecy about how John himself, as we saw in chapter 1, the angel told his dad before he was born, John was going to be the one who prepared the way for the Messiah to come. And Jesus uses that as a proof for these listening people that indeed John had done his job. And of course the inference is if John did his job and introduced me to you, who am I? And so they had to make a decision at that particular point with regard to that. And he said, you know, you're not doing very well with regard to this because the people who had committed to be baptized by John, verses 29 and 30, those who had been aware of their sin, wanting to repent, those who had undergone John's baptism, those were the ones who were ready to receive this next message that Jesus gave. The Pharisees had said, we don't need to be baptized. Only sinners are baptized, and we're not sinners. And so those who had refused John's baptism were indicating that they were unready to accept the gift that was coming to them in the Messiah. He says, you know, you guys, you're just like kids. You know, somebody says, well, let's play wedding, and so we want to dance and sing and all of that. And then you say, oh, we don't want to do that. That's my people. Now that's my people who are the joyful people. Somebody else says, let's play funeral. And so we start playing funeral, and then you say, I don't want to do that either. And so nothing will please you, is what he says. You don't like John's message, and you don't like my message. He says, but wisdom, verse 35, wisdom is proven by all her children. You're going to see how this, in coming days, how this is actually going to be coming to pass. And then we have the sweet, sweet, sweet little picture of this lady. She is identified as a sinner, which means she probably was a prostitute. She crashes the party at the lunch or dinner that was given for Jesus by this Pharisee. Apparently, once you finish the synagogue service, many times a guest preacher was invited to go to one of the dignitaries' homes and have lunch and continue the teaching. And at that time, it was common for uninvited people to come so that they could kind of get some of the pearls of wisdom that would come from this teacher's continuing to speak forth of the word. And so this is the situation that we see this woman come into. And she is overcome with emotion. She is so grateful. She's weeping and weeping and weeping. They are sitting around the table. They are actually reclining around the table, and she can't get to his head to put this wonderful fragrance on his head, and so instead she does it to his feet. She undoes her hair, which of course was a scandalous thing in that society. She does it so that she can wash his feet, wipe his feet, and then the Pharisee standing there, knowing who she was, and Jesus knowing what his thoughts are. What does it say? Verse 39, when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who's touching him, what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner. Notice what Luke says. Jesus answered him. Even though he didn't say anything, Jesus answers him and says, I've got something to tell you. And so he speaks about the fact that if you have been forgiven a whole bunch, you are going to tend to be more grateful and more loving than if you have only been forgiven a very small amount. Simon, the Pharisee, didn't need forgiveness. So he also didn't have any love to give, whereas this woman, the outcast of society, was one who had done even the little things that apparently Simon and his servants had not done for that. He didn't have any forgiveness. She knew she was forgiven. Apparently she would have been in contact with Jesus before, because at the last verse it says, verse 50, Your faith has saved you. It wasn't what she did to Jesus that saved her. It wasn't the gift that she gave. It was the fact that her faith had saved her. And because of that faith, chronologically we can see that she was so grateful that all she could do was weep and be thankful and be grateful for that. An unlikely person. That centurion was an unlikely person. And Jesus, Luke is telling us, is the Savior for unlikely people. I was thinking about that this morning. There's an unlikely person in my life that really is very, I think, impervious to the gospel. And my husband and I were talking about him last night. What will it take for this young man to come to Christ? An unlikely person. These people did, and so nothing is impossible with Jesus. You know, you may feel like you're an unlikely person. Too much baggage, not good enough, everything's against you, and yet Jesus has come for you as well as for those who appear to have their life more put together. Our Lord Jesus Christ, the man of compassion, the man who is willing to demonstrate God's kingdom by speaking against the authorities, but also is willing to demonstrate God's kingdom by his compassion to the poor, to the downtrodden.